Well, it's an honor to welcome Lenny Parracino to the show. Lenny and I worked together. I worked with Lenny for a few years with the LA Clippers. Lenny's still with the team. Lenny, would you I'll give you a little bit more of an intro. Lenny is soft tissue sort of extraordinaire. Not only that, but he's got a ton of knowledge and just great rehab and fitness and performance and many other things. I was always constantly learning from you, Lenny, on the road. Lenny's constantly studying and wealth of knowledge. So it's really an honor to have you join all of us today.
Oh, it's my honor. I love to share, and caring is sharing. So
yeah, that's always one thing, man. You're just like, you love to teach. And for people that are trying to learn and just other professionals in the field, it's just amazing to have folks like you, because that's how it should be. We should all be learning from each other, pushing each other to understand things better. That's how we drive the profession forward. So you're one of those guys, man, that I've met that was always pushing the envelope and learning, and that's always very it's really cool to see that. So welcome to the show. I just for a little bit more background on you, I wanted to just kind of for people listening to kind of understand where you're coming from. How did you get into this field? Was it something that you knew at a young age that you were going to get into, or was it something that later on you kind of discovered?
yeah, I guess when I reflect back, I was about 13 or 14 years of age, and I became like infatuated with movement and muscles. And I remember picking up my first bit of education. I hope people don't laugh at this, but it was muscle and fitness. I wanted to learn about muscles and movement, right? So obviously involved in sports, but also the aesthetic part of it. I thought that was really cool. And I wasn't a big cartoon guy, but I remember seeing a muscle and fitness and I was just drawn to it. And then I got a subscription. And so I learned early on at a young age, as much as I could, reading these magazines, interestingly. But of course, that led to wanting to learn more. And I
Mm-hmm.
was really gifted at an early age with a stepfather who, in today's day and age, would probably be considered abuse, to be real. But I had a very strict upbringing when I was
Mm-hmm.
very, very young. But the thing I reflect back on now, being much older, is it really taught me to think for myself. And, I was in a chess club at 13 years of age playing adults. And his
Mm-hmm.
big thing was you got to be able to think through things and solve problems. So I always
Mm-hmm.
wanted to know how things worked. And I think that's what's led me to where I am today. When I
Yeah.
reflect back now that I'm older, I never followed. I always listened. There's a big
Mm-hmm.
difference. And I always say, like, for youngsters, if I was to give any kind of advice, and I think at my age now, I have a little bit of wisdom, not a lot, but a little. And it's really having the adaptability and the humility. Like,
Mm-hmm.
things are constantly changing. They really are. And I always liken it to, if you look at your phone today compared to 10 years ago, it's massively different. The
Mm-hmm.
capacity of a phone today, what it can do even compared to 5 years ago, massively different. So as technology changes, our understanding changes.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same with the human body. So this whole idea of like, oh, I'm going to go and touch the psoas. Well, not really,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's a region. It's a way to communicate. But is that actually what we're doing?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, and a long way of saying, I was really infatuated with movement, anatomy at a very early age, and then it's just kind of led me through where I am today.
And you were also involved, sort of, you did bodybuilding, correct? And were really sort of you were doing that kind of sport fitness stuff at a young age as well, correct?
Yeah, accidentally. I was actually involved with early on. It was baseball coming from the East Coast. Then it was soccer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I got into individualized sports where I really focused on bicycle motocross.
Mm-hmm.
And, I always say to people, how many people wake up in the morning and return to their level of incompetence, right?
Mm.
In other words, we usually gravitate towards what we're good at
Yeah.
And so I got on a bike and I was actually pretty good at it. Won
Mm.
the state championships. And then I wanted to go nationally. I had to get bigger and stronger. So I started weight training.
Mm.
And as bike racing kind of fizzled out, I continued with the weight training. Once again, I started developing muscles. I could
Mm-hmm.
never get really big, but I was always shredded and symmetrical,
Yeah.
which back then, when drugs weren't too crazy, it actually worked. So I was
Mm-hmm.
able to compete. Someone said, "Hey, why don't you just do a show?"
Yeah.
And back then it was like the Arnold Schwarzenegger days. And there was a couple, there was twins called the Barbarians, and they were
Yeah.
kind of cool. And so I was like, yeah, I'll try it. And so I did that. Yeah. So I got
Cool.
into the fitness part early on.
And then when you went to school, what did you have a major? Was it kinesiology?
Yeah, it was basic exercise science or health sciences with an emphasis on nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of led me into the personal training. But back then, to be a personal trainer, you had to have a physique. Like, and even today, that happens a lot.
Yeah.
People with physiques, especially because of social media. Well, back then, we didn't have social media, but people kind of knew who you were in the gym. So they
Yeah.
wanted to train with you. And I always knew, well, I got to have an education behind that.
Yeah.
So that's in parallel. Even though I was training people, I was going to school to learn as much as I possibly could. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of beyond that, beyond the undergrad, you started getting certifications as massage therapy, movement certifications.
Well, what happened was I was running a program out of a gym, and I did not know this, but we were number one in sales throughout the United States. So the owner from California, and being in bicycle motocross and then getting into fitness, I always dreamed of being in California because they were always better and more progressive than we were in
Mm-hmm.
Connecticut. So anyway, the owner from California called me up and asked me, "How are you doing what you're doing?" And I had a very interesting answer. I said, "Well, I'm not following your program." And he said, "Well, what do you mean? You're number one in sales." I said, "I didn't know I was number one in sales."
Uh-huh.
And he goes, "Well, what are you doing?" And I said to him, "I'm giving people what they want and a package of what they need." And he said, "What?" I said, "Well, I'm listening to the individual coming in. No one walks into a gym wanting nutrition. They want to
Mm-hmm.
change their body. But I gave them a package that was whole to get them to their goals."
Mm-hmm.
So he found that to be an interesting answer. I met with him, and then later he brought me out to California, and one thing led to another where they hired me, and it was my ticket to California.
Mm.
And that's what brought me out to California. And as I get involved with the organization, I started to progress more so into the biomechanics. And that company ended up buying the National Academy of Sports Medicine.
Mm.
And I became an instructor for the National Academy of Sports Medicine. We
Mm-hmm.
then bought a clinic where we had both the academic end of it, but also we had a clinic where we would see all different types of athletes, including young athletes. We built a junior athletic conditioning program, and then we work with some of the Phoenix Suns.
Mm-hmm.
And I got really interested in, once again, the anatomical side, the assessment side, the palpatory side, the manual therapy side. So my director, who's a physical therapist and a really skilled manual therapist because he studied overseas and
Mm-hmm.
brought a lot of that knowledge back to the United States, Dr. Michael Clark, said to me, he's like, "You know what? It doesn't make sense to go to physical therapy school, but I can see you really love using your hands.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you go to massage therapy school?"
Mm-hmm.
So in tandem of working with the National Academy of Sports Medicine, working in a clinic, working academically, I actually went to massage therapy school, which was a blessing
Mm-hmm.
because you get so much hands-on education. Now, interestingly, the people teaching the massage therapy were also chiropractors that had a Rolfing background.
Mm.
So I got introduced to Dr. Ida Rolf's work early on.
Yeah. Amazing
And
work.
so, yeah, great work, right? She was way ahead of her time. And there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people today that I study from that originally were Rolfers
Yeah.
and said firsthand that she was way ahead of her time. She observed things, but just didn't have the explanatory model correct.
Right.
And they're doing the work right now to try to
Yeah.
explain what she was observing.
Yeah.
And so that led to, me really getting involved in that side of things. But coming from a strength and conditioning side, and
Mm-hmm.
get a chance, I'll share with you guys my model that I've developed using this very eclectic approach and eclectic experience. And what's neat about it is it's been built retroactively. In other words, making a lot of mistakes in the clinic,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of failures, like why people don't come back to see me, and
Mm-hmm.
starting to come up with solutions for the mistakes that I've made.
Yeah.
And still a model that's obviously working. It's a working document, and it's always getting better with, information that, we're now understanding, at least as we see it today.
Yeah. And it's, as you said before, it's constantly changing. We're always constantly learning. It's one of
Yeah,
the things I liked about Ida Rolf's stuff is I read her stuff when I was going through school, and I always come back to it. And it's like more amazing every time I come back to it. But now as I study more fascial work with Robert Schleip and Helen Langevin, they have they're discovering all these things about fashion. We're going to get into this a little bit more later with the latest research, but we have these explanations for a lot of the things now that before were kind of, a meridian line. Well, what the hell's a meridian line?
right.
We actually have some answers for what those can be described like in an actual real sense now. So, and I'll link the workflow that you just mentioned in the show notes, so everyone watching can have that. So you got into all this stuff. It's a real nice blend of physical fitness. You have the movement background. Now you're getting your hands on people and doing the massage stuff. When was it how long have you been with the Clippers now?
7 years.
7 years with the Clippers. And
Yeah.
before that, did you open your own practice? How did you get into sort of seeing patients on a regular basis?
Yeah. When I left after 10 years, the National Academy of Sports Medicine and the group, the holding company, they actually sold. So there was rumor that, Lenny, you're going to be out of the clinic now, even though you're 50% education, 50% clinic. You're going to be out of the clinic because you make way more money
Mm-hmm.
producing the academic side. And I didn't feel true to myself,
Mm,
because there's a lot of people that I know that produce information, but they're not practically applying it.
mm-hmm.
And what my passion was to help people in the trenches. I'm
Yeah.
not a researcher, and I argue with a lot of people that tout themselves as researchers. Are you really a researcher?
Mm,
Are you reading research?
mm-hmm.
And so after 10 years, I went into private practice, and I still to this day have a private practice. Even though I'm
Yeah.
with Flippers full time,
Yeah.
I maintain a private practice because I really enjoy the varied population and the challenges that brings.
Mm-hmm.
I would be very limited if I only worked with these superior athletes.
Yeah.
That being said, I've learned a lot
Mm-hmm.
working with these superior athletes, a lot.
Right. Yeah.
Not only one on one, but also because I'm around a team. And the one thing, this, Joey, the one thing that doesn't matter at this level is money.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to get 3 different specialists from around the world
Mm-hmm.
evaluating one MRI,
Mm-hmm.
or no, I want a different type of MRI. And man, do you learn. I have
Yeah.
seen things change 180 degrees because one doctor will challenge another doctor,
Mm-hmm.
all because the person you're working with might be up for a $300 million contract.
Yeah.
You and I would never get that service.
Right.
And so it's taught me a lot. What also has taught me a lot is the type of biometrics that we use to monitor everything. A lot of people don't know
Mm-hmm.
that. Watch any given game on TV,
Yeah.
all the athletes' accelerations, decelerations, miles per hour they're moving, mileage that they're partaking in, all
Yeah.
this stuff is monitored.
That blew me away when I learned how much they were measuring per game with these chips in their shorts or their jerseys. I was just blown away. I mean,
Yeah.
if you can think of it, they're measuring it.
Yeah. The one thing we recently started doing, which I found extremely fascinating, you probably saw this when you were with the hockey organization, but an athlete, and anyone can do this, an athlete they'll weigh themselves before an event and after. And
Yeah.
you'd be surprised how much weight they actually lose in
Oh,
fluid.
yeah. Yeah.
And
A lot.
so, yeah, and we have patches now to determine how much of it's potassium, sodium, magnesium, and how
Mm-hmm.
the athlete can then supplement.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's taught me a lot. Yeah.
Cool. So let's go into more about what your role with the Clippers is. What do you do on a daily basis there in terms of seeing these athletes?
Well, I was hired as a soft tissue therapist.
Mm-hmm.
The unique part about being with this organization is we have a team that works together. In my experience, I've been in other organizations and I've talked to people in other organizations where the strength and conditioning doesn't always see eye to eye with the physical therapy. It doesn't always see eye to eye with athletic training.
Mm-hmm.
But Dr. John Meyer's done an amazing job really integrating all of us, and Todd
Mm-hmm.
Wright's done an amazing job. All departments really work seamlessly.
Mm-hmm.
So compared to when I first started to where I am now,
Yeah.
I'm more integrated in and we all just work together. Um, it just so happens in most pro organizations that I've been around, people tend to have their guys, their people that they work with.
You mean the individual players?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a couple in particular that I work with. One, I'll do not only the treatments, but
Mm-hmm.
also the strength and conditioning.
Okay.
Whereas the other athlete, I just do the treatments and I integrate that knowledge with a team of people.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what you can cover all the bases there. Tissue
Yeah.
work, activation, mobility, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And you'll see when we discuss what I put together as soft tissue management
Yeah.
phases or the model that I use. It's one thing as a manual therapist, it's critical that you apply loads.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where, when I get on social media and you have people saying, well, you can't change fascia and all this, it's very myopic thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll very easily explain where we're missing the pieces on that. There's a difference between changing the chemical side and the true morphology side.
Mm.
And in the end, if you're looking to change morphology, you need tension and time.
Yeah.
But you can change viscoelasticity very, very quickly. You
Yeah.
can change the nervous system very quickly. And
Mm-hmm.
that might be the needed prerequisite to change the morphology.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a fancy way of saying I get the unique opportunity with this one athlete to do the treatments
Mm-hmm.
when necessary, and sometimes they're not, in addition to the loading and the types of loading where there's different loading behaviors, and
Mm-hmm.
everything is relative to what a person needs capacity wise.
Right. Yeah, you would say that often is really that you have to have load to create a change
Yeah.
in that tissue that's going to be a lasting change. And
Yeah.
so with the hands-on work that you're doing, that's when you say viscoelasticity, that's what you're affecting there when you're doing the hands-on work. Is that correct? And then the load is sort of more of the overall more morphology of changing that actual tissue state for the long
Correct.
term.
Yeah, correct. Whether it's, sarcomeric length or actual changes in the collagen formation. I mean, all that takes tension over time.
Yeah.
Um, I love the analogy, the dental analogy.
Mm-hmm.
You have to brush and floss as a habit.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't, you're going to get morphological changes that you're not going to like in your mouth,
Yeah.
right? Now, if I said to you, I have really crooked teeth, I'm going to go to the dentist, they're going to straighten them, I'll be right back for this podcast. Yeah, you would laugh at me,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Takes time.
It takes tension over time, and they're called braces,
Yeah.
right? It's no different than any other tissue in the body.
Right.
So that increase in internal rotation or external rotation of the hip was either more neurally driven and or
Mm-hmm.
viscoelastically driven.
Yeah.
To maintain that, you have to apply a habit over time.
Mm-hmm.
And then how far you can go will depend on what I call the competition and adaptation. Well, what
Mm.
are you doing in your sport? What are you doing in your lifestyle relative to the load input to that specific capacity?
Right.
That's why I call it competition and adaptation. The
Mm-hmm.
body's just adapting. And that's another thing I think is very important to understand is ultimately the organism is doing what? It's conserving energy. It's not preserving anatomy.
Mm.
Its job is not to preserve
It
anatomy.
follows a
That's
path of
our
least
job.
resistance.
We're doing our best to try to decrease entropy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, your body's just conserving energy. And so if we want a lasting change, and it's really pseudo-permanent, right? Because of the fact of entropy, things are degrading any way you look at it.
Yeah.
You're just trying to slow the process down. Then you have to apply these habits, just like brushing, flossing.
Yeah, I love that analogy. That's stuck with me ever since we met because it makes total sense. Age, inactivity, tissue becomes matted. If you don't, you know, the old cliche, if you don't use it, you lose it. It's really true.
Very true.
You've got to work those tissues. It's like you have to keep moving. And I noticed on your email, it's the end says, keep moving. I think it says. And
well, yeah, you really think about movement. Like, here's one for you. If you date back, like I started kind of this passion at 14 and where I'm at right now. So I'm like 42 years into this.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm a self-proclaimed thinker. I drive in my car with no music and I just talk to myself. That's why when you invited me to do this, I'm like, oh, finally, I can talk to somebody. This is great. I can't wait. You need to invite me to the loft. I just want to hang out in your loft and let's have a book club. Like,
listen,
because sometimes no one wants to talk about this stuff.
Dude, you're always welcome, man. I hope you come ASAP.
So here's my thing. I'm driving and I say to myself, fact, movement is a signal of life. All right. I've read it before. You've read it before. Really dig deep into that, though. Anything in the living world, if it doesn't move, it will slowly degenerate, decay, and die.
Mm.
That's a fact. So movement is a signal of life.
Mm.
Then I say to myself, well, how do we learn to move? And remember, I've been in this for years. I mean, I've taught and wrote textbooks for NESM and other organizations. And I'm like, I don't know the answer.
Mm.
And I would ask people that. And I ask you, like, think about it. How do we learn to move? People say, well, I watch my parents or well, no, blind people move. So, I mean, they don't move maybe as well as somebody that has input from that sense. So there was an embryologist that answered the question. I finally found the answer. We move through pressure and tension that we sense based on an urge, based on urges. And I got this video of a baby learning to move, and it's quite fascinating. Now think about this. The 5 senses we learned in school, there's only one that 99% of the time you can't live without. I say 99% because there is someone that lived, but it was a very unique case where in most of the medical cases they died. There's only one sense. If you lose it, only one. Do you know which one it is?
Thinking.
So think about it. Can you live without sight? Yes.
Yeah.
Can you live without taste? Yes. Can you live without hearing? Yes. You live without smell. How do you know where you are right now? Yes. And it's the exact way we learn to move. And it's also manual therapy. And there's things about it we don't understand. Right? And that's why there's a handful of people that I would let touch me. You're one of them. Because even when I watch you, even on your videos, I can tell that you know how to touch. You unite the energy.
Right.
Right? It's not a first day at jiu-jitsu class. Right? And Ida Rolf said it best. How do you know enough is enough with touch? When there's a motor intention to withdraw. So if a person is tensing up on the table, that is a protective response, and you don't go any further. Right. When I teach it like an elevator. You're going like down an elevator, and you just got to know when to stop. All relative to the individual. And interestingly, they actually use that as a way to test tissue resilience. So again, it goes back to movement. Like that's what we all do. Is we're trying to improve movement because we know when the system is protecting, what does it do? It always brings an inward reaction, less movement. You see it with older people. It's a great example, right? But the more we can fortify movement capacity in somebody, we can bring their sphere of function outward. They're able to do more.
Yeah. Fascinating. That was an amazing description. I'm going to look at my show notes here. When it comes to the athletes, Lenny, what are some of the major things that you find? Because you're tweaking, you're tweaking some of the best athletes in the world. I mean, how much is there really to do? Are you finding that, these guys need a lot of work? Are they innately special in some way? I mean, because I found, I agree with you. You said in the beginning, you really love having your private practice because of just that it's different. And I agree. Like, I really love the private practice more so, but working with the team was huge, amazing. I learned a lot.
Yeah.
What are you actually working on with them? What do you find are the big things?
It's a great question. And I know you're a thinker too. We used to sit next to each other on the plane and we both had journals, and when you journal, you're thinking through and going through it. And one of my big aha moments was based on a confusion of working with literally some of the greatest athletes in the world, Hall of Famers, and not just in basketball, because at the Meyer Institute of Sport, we have all sports. And like right now, I'm working with one of the top UFC fighters. And what I started to realize journaling my experience is this aha moment. And this is a really important one. I actually have a slide that I can gladly show you guys. I mean, it's just one thing, but I have a bunch of pictures around it. And that is, one can exhibit global function. Now, with that word function, you can put anything in there. UFC fighting, basketball, baseball, I don't care. Whatever. Yet lack local tissue capacity. And so how I came up with this was, I remember we had a trade. And this one player was the fastest in the league. The complaint was he was too fast. The team couldn't keep up in his heyday. He did things on the court like, it was amazing to watch. So we get him on a trade, and I saw a knee that was like, it was horrible. If it walked into your office tomorrow, you're like, man, we got to get an MRI immediately. Chronically hot, swollen. You could pick apart instability, both passively, actively, table, off table. And yet he would score 30 points. And I needed to understand that. How does that work? Do they just compensate well? What does that really mean? So that's where it came to my understanding that one can exhibit global function, yet lack local tissue capacity. And here's the reason why. We as an organism, we are a system. We are a system. In order to be a system, you have to have elements and interconnectedness with those elements and a purpose. But as the system's demands rise, so do the contributions of the system. In other words, and this is a positive for a lot of people, you can have a shitty knee, but if you have a really good foot and a really good hip and the way it all integrates, you might just be fine until you're not. Right. So here's the answer to your question. What I've learned to do is I've learned to work on the elements. Okay, here's a question that I pose. in our era, I would argue, based on how much intense play, the performance, and how long he's done this, the greatest athlete in our era is LeBron James.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you like him or not, it's just based on the physical attributes of what he's able to do and perform. And remember, you know this, the postseason is an entirely different season.
Mm-hmm.
Intensity-wise, what their bodies go through. And I think he's been in every postseason but 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he goes deep into the postseason.
Crazy volume.
Crazy volume. And so he says to you, Joey, I'm going to hire you for 1 year. I'm going to give you $5 million. All I expect you to do is present a strategy to me. How are you going to help me?
Mm-hmm.
You're posed with that question. And I would sit there and say, he's not going to hire you if you start talking basketball.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do I go to a basketball player, even if I played all these years, to try to teach them a different way of playing? What I would argue is the best ability is availability. What I want to know is based on capacities, and we can talk about the various capacities. Where are the weaknesses?
Mm-hmm.
Because like I said earlier, so often we get up in the morning, we gravitate towards what we're good at.
Mm-hmm.
How many people really challenge themselves and say, I want to find my weaknesses and I'm going to focus on them?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So what I want to know when I'm working with an athlete are what are their capacities?
Mm-hmm.
Where can I help the lagging capacity?
Mm-hmm.
Because the way the human learns to move is through afference, right? Which is inputs that then are organized in the brain to give you the relative output.
Right.
And you can't have motion where you don't have it.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can help to improve the capacity of these elements, then I have a solution for the question to LeBron.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And very rarely, like if I ask an athlete, you know, here's what a capacity is, here are the capacities relative to the function, where are your strengths and where do you think your weaknesses are?
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are very intuitive and they'll let you know.
Yeah.
And they're actually happy with the question because now it's an individualized approach and not just a random model being thrown at them, which often happens.
Yeah. That reminds me of something that I remember you saying too, is you create options for movement and then you strengthen those options kind of just in a simple way, just sort of to illustrate what you were just explaining is basically if LeBron James can, you say, okay, well, let's find where he perhaps lacks some motion in
Right.
the frontal plane, the sagittal plane, something you take him through some movements perhaps, and then you say, okay, let's increase this lateral hip shift or whatever it is. You say, okay, you're lacking here. You show it to him. You say, look, you can do it on your left side, but not your right. You go in there, do some work. You open up options for that movement, and then you strengthen. That's kind of what you're talking about, correct? In terms of finding those capacities.
Yeah, and I would say even more specifically, I have what we call soft tissue management phases, and it's nice because I use the handout for people in the clinic and even athletes, but I also use it to teach where we have 5 phases. The 5th phase being function. So technically for us, we have 4 phases, but in total, so people can view it, it's 5 phases, right? The first phase is balance, sensitivity, and fluid regulation. Now, these go very deep. Like in my journals, this is a whole chapter in itself, and it's ongoing because we're starting to see more of what's called interstitial stasis. And a lot of experts believe that is the key understanding to chronic pain or people that just can't get out of a pain syndrome is this interstitial stasis. And I can talk about different papers. There's a paper that was just written not long ago, and everyone's like, wow, this is explaining a lot because we never knew there was pre-lymphatic pathways. We just couldn't see it. It goes back to my phone analogy. You know, look what the phone can do today compared to 5 years ago. Well, guess what? It's changing in medicine too, what we can't see. Dr. Rebecca Pratt just did a lecture on this, in particular, looking at the element of hyaluronan. She says, well, hopefully there'll be MRIs that will be dynamic and able to see fluid flow. So the changes in viscosity. So the first phase is sensitivity and fluid regulation, so this is the nervous system and the circulatory system. They go hand in hand. What I would really strongly recommend to people is to understand that when there's an increase in viscosity, which is a measurement of the fluid's resistance to flow, that's what you feel with your hands. That's what people feel when they're stiff. Stiffness isn't architectural shortness. Stiffness is actually a change in the fluid dynamics of the body. And so when you have this increased viscosity,
which, by the way, I just want to make sure people know, when you have increased viscosity, it's more thick, it's less fluid, because that's often confused.
Yes, it's like having ketchup in your refrigerator. You go to pull it out and you can't get it out of the bottle.
Yes.
Right? It's thick, or thick honey.
Right.
Exactly. You have increased pressure on free nerve endings, which changes sensation. So point is, the fluid is directly correlated to the nervous system. Some of the researchers will call this stretch shielded. So let's say, for example, make it practical. Oh man, I don't know what I did yesterday. My back is stiff. A fundamental movement is spine flexion, right? So I go to put my sock on in the morning and I don't get good glidability. The research calls that shear strain. It's how there's a shearing where one layer of dense tissue will move on another layer of dense tissue. Well, in between, there's like a biological WD-40 called loose connective tissue. And that's where the viscosity can become greater. So you don't get as much slidability. There's been research done on this. It's really fascinating. We can get on to that later. But what happens is, as that movement takes place, what's being stimulated? The sensory organs. Right? The proprioceptors. They're being stimulated, or technically it's called mechanoreception, or mechanoreceptors that cause proprioception. So what happens is the brain is alert to know what's going on, and it regulates the tone to deal with the function. But say you go to reach, and there goes your back. Your back hurts. That's because of the lack of mechanoreception, or the lack of afferents to create the proper efferents. So afferent just means to the brain. Efferent means away from the brain. So now the brain wasn't able to regulate the tone relative to the function. Here's a great example. And this confuses people all the time. Person in the gym lifts the gym. We're talking power lifters. We're talking strong people. No problem. But they go to pick their baby up and they blow their back out. That's what explains it. Because that always frustrated me as a practitioner. How come this person is so strong, but they still get injured? And it goes back to what I said in the beginning, my big aha moment. And that is, one can exhibit the global function, right? Yet lack the local tissue integrity. Because that integrity changes depending on where you are in the day. It's a very dynamic process. So my phase one is balancing sensitivity and fluid regulation. Number one, you have a massive swelling in your knee. It's going to cause inhibition. It's going to cause a lack of proprioception. And those are big. So let's just say sensitivity is great. Let's say the fluid regulation is great, because that's a whole subject in itself. If people want to learn more about it, we can dig down that path. But what I will say, this is my strong opinion as I take you through these phases. Phase number one, balance sensitivity and fluid regulation, that is manual therapy. It's nothing more than that. So it does amazing things, but there's a lot going on in phase one. But I don't care if you call it ART, MAT, cupping, scrape. I don't care what you call it. Physiologically, this is what you're working with.
And that's what you're affecting.
If I said to you, Joey, you came to me and you say, Lenny, I don't know, man, I just want a little bit more muscle in my arms. They look great, but I just want a little more. I said, come on to my office. I'm going to rub it. I'm going to rub on you. I'm going to use my manual therapy skills and we're going to hypertrophy your muscle. You call bull on that.
Mm-hmm.
The human hand cannot change the morphology of the tissue.
Mm-hmm.
Can't straighten collagen.
Mm-hmm.
It can't break up scar tissue.
Right.
That's bull.
Yeah.
It can't do that,
And
right?
that's what we hear a lot is, oh, we're getting in there,
Well,
we're breaking things up.
I just had a surgeon refer someone and said, and this kid just so happened to be a scientist over at SpaceX. He's like, the
Mm-hmm.
doctor said to come in to see you to break up the scar tissue. And I said,
Mm-hmm.
well, here's some literature. I know you're a science geek. This guy's got like 2 PhDs. I said, there's no such thing. He went back, met with the doctor, and the doctor goes, he's right.
Mm.
It's not me, it's the research. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
I wish we could do that with the human hand. We just
Yeah.
can't. But what we
Yeah.
can do is we can alter sensitivity, improve that regulation, and we can improve the regulation of the fluids.
Mm-hmm.
We know we do it all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. So the second phase is force production, reduction, and transfer. Most injuries happen in the transfer. So they're all important. Okay. And so let's just say a person comes in with patellofemoral problems. You balance the sensitivity, you get good fluid regulation. Can the anterior compartment of their thigh produce force? And can they do it in a gradient fashion? So like a volume knob, contract 1, 2, 3, 4, not just jump to 10. That's one of the mistakes made with muscle testing is we're looking at it as if there was an injury per se.
Mm-hmm.
Can they grade that contraction properly? The slow twitch to the fast twitch in a very smooth, efficient manner.
Mm-hmm.
And then can they reduce that force? So you can think of it as a concentric scale and an eccentric scale. And then can they transfer that?
Right.
Okay. Once that compartment of tissue, that continuum of tissue can do that, and I often see this. So this is like good physical therapy, does phase 1 really well, does phase 2 really well, and then they often jump because they're doing better. Maybe it's insurance didn't give them enough visits, whatever. They jump right to because the person's feeling better. Remember, that's the tricky part. If you start feeling better in phase 1, you think you're healed. Healing and feeling are 2 different processes, both important. 2 different chapters in your book.
Yeah.
Right. So you got to be really careful. That's why I use this chart with people all the time, not just in teaching and my own cheat sheet to study, but also helping people understand where they are and where they're, where they're going.
Yeah.
And so once you have this force production, reduction, and transfer, the third phase is, can you do it at a rate of speed relative to your function? Because it's a different behavior. And that's where a lot of this fascial literature is really starting to step up, because what it's showing is the elastic recoil behavior. And this started when we started looking at force production and the rate at which we produce force in animals. Now, you've played sports, you play sports. Humans are weak relative to animals. Imagine if you can run on a soccer field like a gazelle, an antelope, but their muscles aren't big.
Right.
So scientists started really understanding this. And now we know when we run, our muscles are working more isometrically compared to concentrically, eccentrically. There's not a lot of length change in the red tissue. A lot of the length change is happening in the white tissue, just like in the animals.
Yeah.
But you have to have that specific behavioral capacity.
Yeah.
And if you don't, and after injury, you're going to lose this stuff. You'll lose it pretty quickly. This is why these phases become so important. Right? So I'll give you a great example. Soleus test. Well documented now in the literature. Everybody's doing it in the NBA. That's great. But what about a pogo? How well can you pogo now? In multiple dimensions,
right,
relative to the function, not just in the sagittal plane.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to have a good soleus test. You're able to produce the force, even reduce it, and maybe even do it in a transfer behavior. But now can you relax the contractile state of the tissue and bounce at a frequency of 160 contacts per minute or 170 or 180 or wherever you have to go relative to the function?
Yeah.
So phase 3 becomes, again, this rate of force production, reduction, and transfer that becomes critical.
Yeah.
And we try to explain this to all our people. I'm like,
Yeah.
before you go for a run,
Yep.
you have to be able to show me some recoil here in a controlled environment, in the clinic, at home. And then the fourth phase is patterns. So this is when you start to integrate a lunge, a squat, a push, a pull, a climb, right? And I like to think about fundamental patterns. Now, where I've, been in this industry so long, when people started to get away from, we'll call it isolation, they started learning about function, they started getting into patterns, and they were like, oh, this makes so much sense. But then we started to see a shift. And I had the unique opportunity of working with some top doctors with ACL rehabilitation, where they tried to get the quad back.
Mm-hmm.
I like to refer to it as an anterior compartment because it's just so much more than quad. But the anterior compartment of tissue back after its inhibition because of the injury and surgery. So they tried these different patterns. Whereas if I was to stress your anterior compartment maximally in an integrated way, the way I would do this is put you on a slant board, so you're plantar flexed, to take out that tissue component.
Mm-hmm.
I tuck your pelvis under to take out the posterior chain component relatively, pin you up against a wall, take your arms overhead, drive it into as much extension as possible or up to the wall, then have you do a single leg squat.
Mm.
And that emphasizes, they use this for tendon loading all the time. This emphasizes the anterior compartment.
Mm-hmm.
And I watch great practitioners do this to later find out it didn't hypertrophy the quad after an ACL. And we had to go to isolated machine-based knee extension.
Mm.
And it goes back to what I said before. As the system's demands rise, so do the contributions.
Yeah.
So this was, I got the unique opportunity of spending 7 years on the jiu-jitsu mat.
Mm-hmm.
And because of where I live, I'm around the Gracies, and they're amazing. Their wisdom, their knowledge. And there is a concept that, I came up with this, but it's based on their teachings. It's called the block principle. And that is, you'll appreciate this because you already know this as a chiropractor, right? In your chiropractic education, is if two bones are moving in the same plane at the same speed, the net motion is zero.
Mm-hmm.
In a practical sense, if you take an Americana, for example, which is the humerus externally rotating precisely enough to wind the capsule so much it breaks.
Mm-hmm.
You never see that in standing. In a UFC fight or, even in jiu-jitsu, because there's a stand-up component to jiu-jitsu as well.
Yeah.
You don't see Americana standing. And the reason for that is there's too many escape zones.
Yeah.
What you'll see is on the floor, the person's pinned.
Mm-hmm.
And a really good jiu-jitsu practitioner knows they have to block all these escape routes to get enough stress into that one area to stimulate it to the degree you break it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my aha moment. We need to do that with exercise. Holy crap.
Mm.
It also goes back to what I said before. This is why I see what I see with these athletes. They exhibit a function that I can only dream of. Yet, when you get into the health of their body, at my age, there's parts of me that are way healthier than them.
Yeah.
So we have to really understand the difference between having a healthy body and one that performs. They're different.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to keep performing for a long time, you should work on the health part.
Mm-hmm.
That's where this whole system came from.
Yeah.
Soft tissue management phases in what
Yeah.
I call the system. And so again, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. And what we do is we have the prerequisites to these patterns, and then we feel comfortable when they function, they have as best as we possibly can monitor a robust system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically, we're just going back to that quad example. When you had the patient in that sort of position where we were on the slant board, the arms up, you're finding that that's not able to create enough basically load into that tissue to create a change. You needed to isolate that sort of, you saying we went to quad extension. You needed to really, to be able to put the amount of load you needed to change that tissue, you got to get on a quad extension machine.
Yeah, and we've seen this quite a few times in the clinic, objectively. With I don't know, you've been over to Meyer Institute of Sport. I mean,
Yeah,
they have
beautiful facility over there.
Extensive biomechanics lab. So all this stuff is metrically tested.
Yeah.
And then there's a newer. This is fascinating because a lot of people don't know this exists. Do you know what a spring is?
Yes.
You've seen it. Isn't it interesting? It's a volumetric scan where you take an MRI. It's a software program that will measure the volume of all tissues in the body.
Yeah.
So you talk about objective measurement when you're doing your treating. Say, yeah, go ahead and do that, what we call phase 4 pattern.
Yeah.
That's a cool pattern, even though you created all these blocks. And I'm cool with it as long as we go back in and metrically can prove that it did its job. And what we found is just in many cases it didn't. So we're not going to waste a bunch of time.
Yeah.
We're going to go right to what we would say a phase 2 force production, production transfer before we integrate it, or in tandem, we can integrate it into the pattern. It's not like you just stay in 2, right? A lot of times 1 and 2 work together. And then sometimes it's a 1, 2, 3. Like I had an athlete today where if you can recall all these phases, when you look at basketball, Joey, what phase are you predominantly in? It's function, I get it. But when we start to look at behaviors, right, you're in a rate of force production, right? You look at basketball, they're constantly moving. If you're moving like a muscle man out there, you're going to look really robotic.
Yeah.
You're moving in a very fluid. So it's like you're using the rate of force production a lot. So what are you going to start to lack as the season gets going? You're going to lack force production. If you're always working on the elastic recoil, and not the contractile tension, right? Because if you're only doing contractile tension like a bodybuilder, you're not going to be able to run and transition the way they do.
Yeah, this is the sort of the train as you need to perform,
right?
In a certain sense, yeah.
So that's why during this season we focus on that. But I had an athlete today, for example, who ever since we've been doing more rate of force production, we're seeing better performance output. But what we don't want to lose is the force production itself, predominantly in the lower extremity. So we did 1 set through phase 2, force production, reduction, transfer. And to make it simple, it's just a heel rise.
Yeah. I was just about to ask you, what's an example of just something?
Low to heel rise. We got to keep the tension constant, right? The whole time. And then the second set through, we did phase 3, pogos. Yeah. Got it. The other example would be, there's a great researcher. You would love his courses, Dr. Enda King. And he came up with this quad load. So for the anterior compartment of the thigh, you're in a split stance. The front leg, the foot goes underneath a bench. So the tibia has to stay vertical. So the foot's under a bench. The front tibia touches the bench, so it stays vertical. There's no translation forward or backwards. Okay. So you're horizontally stretched as far as possible. So at the end range, you're in triple extension. Follow me? The torso is straight up and down. So the ear, shoulder, and hip are in line. So you go straight up, straight down. The trail leg is the one loaded, like big time, You feel it through the anterior compartment of your torso into the anterior compartment of your thigh. It's great for the patellar tendon, retinaculum. And obviously you're getting the plantar fascia, you're getting great toe extension. And so again, phase 2, it's control, right? Deceleration, acceleration, perfect transfer. We try to get up to 30 to 50% of body weight. That's one of the prerequisites that Enda King has come up with in his research. He's not only a PhD researcher, but he's an amazing clinician. So it's very rare to have both. Like he's a researcher and a clinician. So his information is just fascinating.
Yeah.
And so 30 to 50% of body weight is considered good. It's a lot, right? When you think about that exercise and you do it. So then phase 3 would be the rate. So I'll have the athlete decelerate, but then explode, decelerate, explode. And it's amazing how many people can do one and not the other. We've had that.
Yeah.
So we've had athletes that can do a phase 3 recoil.
Yeah.
They have troubles with the force production. I would argue you'll see that more in youth.
Yeah.
You'll see it in
fascinating that you'll find that
run around, but they don't have really good contractile behavior. Yeah.
Fascinating that you'll see that in somewhere like the NBA potentially, or these levels of just crazy athletics where you can find these areas that are lacking.
Yeah. That's the whole idea. The whole idea is to find these things and then just have a one-on-one talk with the athlete saying, hey, listen, you're great. You're already great.
Yeah.
The best ability is availability. And the way we stay available is we work on these capacities.
Yeah.
Now, I don't believe in injury prevention. I believe in mitigating damage. I mean, listen, sports are sports. Stuff's going to happen. You know, to sit here and say, oh, it's going to prevent injuries, that's very difficult to say scientifically. But I think the more robust a system is, the more we can mitigate the damage.
What if we're not a pro athlete? What if we are we want to go to our workout class at Equinox, or we like CrossFit? Do you have like a recommendation for most folks? Can you put people into a sort of a box like that, or does it depend on sort of our body type? Like, what do you often recommend to a patient? Is it dependent on the individual in terms of the exercise sort of advice you give?
Yeah, this system is for everyone. Selfishly, I built it for myself. Right. When you look at what we call biomotor abilities, I know Dr. Andy Galpin, he's just a fantastic scientist, and he has a lot of different biomotor abilities. But overall, generally speaking, most experts agree with these biomotor abilities: power, agility, strength, speed, coordination, balance, endurance, and flexibility. The first one to go, most experts agree, is speed. Now, when you look at the model that I presented, that's phase 3, the rate at which you produce force. Okay. To bring up, I don't know if you saw on social media at the Lakers game, was it 2 nights ago? They picked a gentleman out of the stands to shoot a half-court shot.
I didn't see it.
Yeah, and he blew his Achilles tendon.
No way.
Yeah, you can look it up online.
Okay.
The poor guy, he gets out there, right? Older guy, probably played hoops earlier in his life. He's like, I got this. Thousands of fans, right?
Yeah.
Throws the ball like this, and you see him fall to the ground like a sharpshooter. Shot him in the back.
Yep.
And he's hobbling. Everyone's like, oh no.
Yeah.
24 hours later, the report came out. He blew out his Achilles.
Oh.
Okay. How many times is this happening with pickleball?
A lot. I've seen
I talked
a
to
few
2
with
surgeons
pickleball
in the last 6 months. They say business is booming because of pickleball. Take an older person, and now you have them move at a rate of speed they have not moved in a while. So guess what the test is? They come into me, the function is pickleball. I go, how's the sensitivity level, the fluid regulation? Let's just say that's fine. Little bit of soreness maybe from okay, right. What's the first test I'm going to do? Heel rise test. There's no amount of data on this. But let's just compare you versus you. You know, at my age, I should be able to do with proper form, meaning not just bouncing up and down. I should be able to do 60 single leg heel rises, 1 rep per second. 60. But if you start to think about it, if I'm going to play pickleball, right? And I'm not even ready for pickleball. I'm just saying phase 2.
Yeah.
I need to be able to produce the force so that I have the proper health in the tissue to be able to withstand the load, because this brings me to a point. Injury, by definition, is a disruption of unity. It only occurs, physically speaking, when the load exceeds the capacity. Injury is super easy to understand. What is super difficult to understand is healing. Because everyone's different. There's genetics, there's environmental variables, chemical variables, there's all these variables. But injury, physically speaking, is pretty easy to understand. You want to rip the paper, you got to be stronger than the paper. Right? So when you look at the function of pickleball and you look at the loads going through the foot and ankle, through the knee, through the hip, and even if you're just guesstimating them, you should be able to do a heel rise. And I'll get people in all the time, they can't even do a heel rise.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, yeah, I use the same model and I share it with you. The difference in pro sports and the way I designed this was based on the fancy metrics that everybody has to use at this level to put a person back into sport. It's called return to play. So there's a lot of biometrics that go into return to play, because if you return somebody too soon, it can be very costly. So I'm like, well, the average person doesn't have access to this fancy equipment. How can I create a system where we teach people at home, hey, you're going to have to do this phase before this phase. Now, you say to me, well, Lenny, I still play pickleball and I'm fine. Exactly. Well, I gave you the explanation as to why. Because don't confuse global function with local tissue capacity. You got away with it. That's fine. But there might be a time where you don't get away with it. And at least now you can look back at the model and say, you know what? I got to go back to A, B, C before I start, writing words down in sentences and paragraphs to write a book. You got to go back to the fundamentals.
And that's where we as clinicians, at least I, with the general population, I tell people all the time, I said, the most common time when people get injured is when they haven't done something for a while and they're starting a new program. They start playing tennis and they're gung-ho and they're playing 2 hours, 3 times a week. And they say, well, my elbow started hurting or my knees are hurting. And or whatever the activity is, I say be very careful as you come back into something, because your body's not used to doing this. And it's going to revolt. You're going to injure yourself. And I see every day there's somebody new that comes in and they've injured themselves because they're getting back into an activity they used to do when they were younger, without the proper prerequisite of getting their body to know how to load that tissue, just going through those steps. So just as a PSA for folks, jumping back into an activity after a while is a high risk of injury.
Well, that goes for anything though in biology, right? Ultimately, a healthy organism has an ebb and flow to it so it can deal with highs and lows. And so even if it's a diet, for example, like I work with a lot of people and they'll ask me about nutrition and they'll ask me about, for example, fasting. Dana White just did this fast. So people will say, hey, what do you think about that? And I'm like, listen, first of all, everybody goes through a fast, right? That's what breakfast is, right? It breaks the fast because at night you're technically fasting. You went a duration of time without eating. And so if you automatically just follow someone else's plan where you're not going to eat for 24 hours, your body could go sideways, a very negative way, because you're changing it so rapidly. If you wanted to get into something like that, you should always start slow. And that's with everything. That's with everything. Everything, and working harder is not the answer. It's working smarter. And I know that's been said a million times, but
Yep.
we got to work smarter, not harder. And that's one of the reasons why I built this, is so it's a handout for people. And I love it because I'll have clients text me back and they're like, man, I think I'm ready for phase 3.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in phase 2 now, but I'm ready for phase 3. And I give them metrics. There's a great book out there I highly encourage people to read. You don't have to read it front to back, but it's called Measure What Matters.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a nice way of understanding, come up with a measurement for somebody. And it can be very simple. And they'll self-test, and then they're progressing. So they don't find out the hard way that they did too much too soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a beautiful model. It's they say that the better, the more simply you can make something, a complex sort of scenario, that's the better the grasp on that subject you have. So the model really is such a nice way to just make it. It just simplifies it. All these sort of complex things that could be, that you can go deep into all these things, but you've broken it down into these 5 steps to say, okay, what phase are we at? And it's a great way to just sort of put somebody into that zone and say, we need to go through these steps. And it's as simple as that. You can see where somebody is.
And what's neat is I've used it with the pathological situations and the dysfunctional situations. And I don't know if we have time for this, but there's a nice talk about models, which I find fascinating, right? And I don't know if you've ever heard the saying by George Box, who's a famous statistician: all models are approximations. All models are wrong, but some are more useful. When I heard that, I'm like, man, I got to understand this more. This is pretty cool, right? And then Dr. Neil Gershenfeld is an MIT physicist. There was a book I was reading. He talked about truth as a model. And I always find that word truth interesting, right? Because your truth could be different than my truth. But what he went on to say is the most common misunderstanding about science is that scientists seek and find truth. They don't. And he's a scientist. They make and test models. Making sense of anything means making models that can predict outcomes and accommodate observations. And so when I have conversations with people, this could be a loft conversation. Joey, what's your model? And it's interesting because if you read the book Outlive by Dr. Peter Attia, and I've studied this beforehand because he just came out that book, his whole beginning chapter talks about this. And Joey, it's fascinating because what he's doing is kind of spilling the beans or creating awareness that if you went to school to become a medical doctor, you have a pathological model. It's a very linear model, which is essential. But you might have a patient that doesn't need it. That's where functional medicine has become popularized, right? Because one's a systems approach and one's a linear cause and effect approach. Now, mind you, the linear thought process in science, X bad agent comes in the body. We know what it is. We know how to arrest it. Doubled our life expectancy. We do not die of the same things we died of 50, 60, 70 years ago. We have antibiotics. We have all these things. But the major cause of death today is what? Degenerative. So you go to the doctor and the doctor says you're fine, but you're going, I'm not fine. I'm sluggish. I'm tired. I'm living on stimulants. I got to have sleep aids. And then we end up dying of these nasty heart disease is degenerative. Cancer is degenerative. And so what a great book. It's titled Outlive. And he talks about models. And this is my argument. And I'll ask you the question. When you went to school, not all of your continuing education that you've done, school, Joey getting out of school, did you learn more pathology or did you learn more dysfunction?
You're talking mostly about in school, we're talking about pathology.
Right. So the hard part is, and physical therapy is the same way. The hard part, and I'm not talking about continuing education. I'm not talking about going off and doing a residency with a sports team, right? But most of the curriculum. So now if I have an athlete that comes in and they're like, yeah, man, I just feel a little bit of tightness on my hammies and I just want to create better linear acceleration.
Mm-hmm.
How is that in the pathology research?
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that that model's wrong.
Yeah.
I would argue there's no models that are wrong. What I'm emphasizing is the model that you use should fit your clientele.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I'm saying. Like, there's many times I refer out. People come to see me because they've gotten results with something else. And I'm like, well, now this model does not work for that particular set of circumstances.
Yeah.
And you hopefully have a good referral base.
Yeah.
And so it's a real fun subject to kind of dig deep into, is this whole idea of a model is nothing more than a system that you put together to simplify complexity.
Yeah.
That's really, everybody has one. They might not write it down and journal it, but you got up in the morning and you had like this mental model of how you're going to get ready for work and go and do your day.
Yeah.
Right. Now, when it comes to your profession and what you do, when it comes to studying and what you study, think about that. What's your model?
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. I want to go back real quick because I get this question a lot. Talking about LeBron James or a Messi or Ronaldo. These guys, obviously, they put in amazing amounts of work. Phenomenal athletes, but they've all been injured very few times in their careers.
Mm-hmm.
How much of that, and then you have other guys that are, or gals, constantly injured. Is there a difference in sort of innate tissue joints? Like, are these people superhumans, or are they just putting in that much hard work that, like, is it a blend of the two? I mean, is there such thing as injury prone? Is that a real thing?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think, yeah, it's a very hard, I think, question to answer. There's definitely a genetic component. One of the things that they're looking into now is the various genes that correlate to when there is a disruption of unity, how the body heals from that disruption of unity. Where you might have more, they call it a Viking's disease, right? And they even think that if you're more on that scale of a Viking, that those people with that genetic propensity might be more susceptible to death with COVID because of the fibrotic development. So you've heard me say this. Think of our resiliency in tissue on a scale of Bendy Wendy at yoga class, who can take her left foot and wrap it around her right ear, versus Stiffy Stevie on the other end of the spectrum, who just for the life of him never has been able to touch his toes or even close.
Yeah.
Right. Which one do you want to move your refrigerator? Stiffy Stevie. Yeah. They're going to be really, really strong, but they're not going to be very extensible. Right. And so the athletes at the highest level, and I've seen this across the board with different sports, are somewhere in the middle, but then there's a scale there.
Yeah.
So you put your hands way out. You got left hand is Benny Wendy, right Stiffy Stevie. All pro athletes are right in the middle.
Yeah.
But then some are more towards Bendy Wendy, some are more towards Stiffy Stevie.
Sure.
And this is a really interesting way of looking at it, because we had a situation, you could see it on film. I couldn't sleep that night. We had one of our star players last year. He had white tights on. He got hit in the air. And the other athlete, the opposing athlete, came down with him. His foot got stuck, and I saw his femoral condyles pop backwards, hyperextension.
I know what you're talking about. I couldn't watch it.
I was like, oh my, I couldn't go to bed, because, they usually do the MRI the next day.
Yeah.
So we don't know the extent of damage. We just know, obviously, he's on crutches, and I'm like, unfortunately, this could be a massive, massive injury.
Yeah.
And all he had was a slight sprain.
Yeah, that was amazing. I could not
And
believe that.
so, whereas I've seen other athletes that are more towards the bendy wendy side,
Yeah.
it's like, what? You hardly saw anything. You're looking at the film going, because everything's on film now in slow motion. He got bumped, and it was like that little bit of translation, femur to tibia, tore an ACL. Are
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
kidding me?
Yeah.
And so there is definitely a genetic component to it. And
Yeah.
then there's a lot of other variables. There's the
Yeah.
nutritional variable. One of the things in the NBA, I will say, it's a nocturnal league. Guys don't go to bed early,
Yeah.
and they try to get as much sleep. We travel a lot.
Yeah.
Where this because you traveled. It's the time zones. There's
Getting
the
in
demand.
late a lot of places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's only so much energy,
Yeah.
and you have to put it as much into recovery as you are putting it into work. And that's starting to become more recognized.
Mm.
That's starting to become more recognized, at least with the athletes that I'm working with.
So how much, going into NBA specifically for a moment, how much do you think this load management is important for the athletes?
Yeah, I think it's gotten blown out of proportion because of social media. We're always load managing, really, when you think about it. We all should be load managing. If I have crappy sleep, I get up the next day, I don't work out hard. I
Yeah.
might just do a zone 2 cardio. Like, you have to be smart.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you can't work your way out of a bad diet. You can't work your way out of bad sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're always load managing. I think the words load management have gotten blown out of proportion.
Mm-hmm.
And listen, there's inside knowledge and then there's the outside, right? I'll listen to things and I'm like, are you kidding me? I just saw something on ESPN like 3 days ago, and they were talking about a player that I work with and only works with about 4 other humans. We won't mention names, Joey. And this person, I'm like, there's no way you know that information. It's not true.
Yeah.
I spent 14 days with this dude. Like, there's no way. So again, it gets so blown out of proportion.
Yeah.
I always say, like, there's fan knowledge and then there's inside knowledge. And it's very different.
Yeah.
One of the things I do love now, unlike when you were with us, is these, not just our guys, but a lot of these guys have podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really cool because it's a platform where they get to express themselves without the filter of the media.
Yeah.
And it's different.
I like those.
And I encourage people to listen to their podcasts.
Yeah.
I had a great time listening to them.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, wow, I'm really getting to know the player more because they're just talking and they're free and they don't feel threatened. It's great.
Yeah.
I know it's a long way of saying, I mean, we're always load managing, and I think we all have to load manage. Because again, what happens when load exceeds capacity? You get a disruption of unity. So yeah.
And we got to keep these players healthy for the postseason. I mean, that's it. You want to win a championship.
Well, it's not only that. Where it's really sad is with the youth. You know how many great athletes there are, but they hit their peak at 12?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the thing that Dr. John Meyer always talks about too. He's like, we got to take this information. We got to get it into parents for the youth.
Yeah.
We get kids with these repetitive strain injuries at 12 years old. I mean, what are we doing? Tommy John surgeries at 12?
Crazy.
Are you kidding me?
Crazy.
That was unheard of when I was a kid playing baseball. But we played all sports. We played outdoors. We were constantly stressing ourselves differently to create a more robust system.
Mm-hmm.
So getting out and doing different things is very important. You're fortifying a better, healthy organism. I met a pediatrician. It's actually my wife's high school friend that went off and became a pediatrician. She owns a practice in San Clemente with 20 other pediatricians. She said post-COVID, we have now seen things we've never seen in our practice ever. The sicknesses. And I said, why? She goes, because we were so isolated. We were not exposed and we didn't develop the immune system. So now we're seeing things we never saw before. And some of them are, potentially, very destructive. And I'm like, the same thing with load.
Yeah.
It's not different.
Yeah.
We get kids that are active only because they play sports. And then when they
Yeah.
get home, they're not as active.
Yeah. And so, sort of like for a weekend warrior, I mean, you're kind of touching on the importance of having some variety and activity. So, for longevity, I'm mostly interested in longevity at this point in my life. There were times when I really focused on lifting weights and trying to bulk or whatever. Now it's more, how do I take care of my connective tissue? I see enough injured patients on a daily basis. I don't want any injuries. I've become so risk averse. I stopped skiing. I stopped doing a lot of things that I could hurt myself. I was obsessed with pickleball last year, and I didn't follow my own advice, and my knees have never had problems. They started to ache because I was playing on that hard concrete, and I
Yeah.
said, I like pickleball, but I don't like it that much. And so I stopped playing soccer. So now it's sort of like a blend of, just sort of some yoga, some weights.
Yep.
Definitely not as intense as it used to be, because what I found is, like, what's the point of getting that sore? And my body doesn't feel good. So would you say it's important for people to have a nice sort of blend of stretching, weight training, or is there one like certain thing that you'd say, do this if you want longevity?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack what you just said. I think generally speaking, the more variability, the better. In fact, when you look at what makes elite athletes elite, the experts will say they exhibit one thing very unique, and that is variability.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to be a task done the same way is never done the same way
Mm-hmm.
from an energy perspective. So let's say, for example, a free throw. You remember Gallinari, who's a
Mm-hmm.
sharpshooter. I
Mm-hmm.
remember fetching balls for him hitting 100 shots in a row,
Insane.
one touch the
Insane.
rim. And there was no defender, but still,
Yeah.
100. Interestingly, they look the same, but they're actually not the same to the organism.
Mm-hmm.
They exhibit this finite variability,
Yeah.
which allows them to accomplish a task a million different ways, where the average person can only do it 100,000 ways. I'm just making those numbers up.
Mm-hmm.
And so generally, to answer your question, yeah, just do whatever you love to do, because if you love to do it, it's a good chance it'll become a habit.
Yeah.
The other side of me says get a specific assessment by someone like yourself or myself,
Mm-hmm.
so you know where your weaknesses are.
Yeah.
And so you can build upon them. I
Yeah.
liken it to the dentist. I go, the doctor looks at me, checks for cancer, checks for the big rocks. Then I go to the hygienist.
Yeah.
Hygienist measures my gums and says, hey, back here, you got to really focus back here. They don't
Mm-hmm.
just say go home, brush and floss. They go, back here, you got to really focus on those teeth, because we're starting to see a
Yeah.
little bit more receding gum line.
Yeah.
You can get some of that back, Lenny. It's
Yeah.
reversible if you work at it. Perfect. So that's a more specific way.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I wanted to unpack what you said, there's two papers in particular written. They correlate to this interstitial stasis and the lack of washing out waste metabolites, which
Mm-hmm.
basically are byproducts of work. So anytime you work, there's a byproduct. I
Mm-hmm.
know this is oversimplified, but you drink, you pee,
Mm-hmm.
you eat, you poop. This is just a fact of biology. You work, there's byproducts. The
Mm-hmm.
key is getting the byproducts out.
Yeah.
So one of the papers is titled this: have we been looking at DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, wrong for 100 years?
Mm-hmm.
Today, what we know about soreness from working out is way different than ever before.
Mm-hmm.
You can grow tissue without soreness. What they
Mm-hmm.
now have proven is the soreness is not caused by muscle damage, although
Yeah.
it may be present. It is actually stasis of fluid putting pressure on free nerve endings. In other words, it's not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I focus on in my own workouts, and I focus on with athletes, is I don't want your workouts to create chronic soreness. If it
Yeah.
happens, like you haven't done lunges in a while, now the question is, the soreness that you experience, let's just say it was you, Joy, did it reduce your range of motion? You're like, yeah, man, I can't even sit on the toilet. Then I'm like, and my notes go way too much for Joey.
Yeah.
We totally overdid it. If you're
Yeah.
like, nah, I just know it's there. Like I kind of know it's there. Hey, let me know how fast that goes away. You're
Yeah.
like, oh, it's gone in 48 hours. Great. Your body washed it out. No problem. Now, there are natural ways we can coach that, guide that process too. That's where I think the cold tub has become extremely popularized. The saunas have become popularized. Normatec has become popularized. Vibration. So again, what phase are we talking about? We're talking about phase one, balance, sensitivity, fluid regulation.
Yeah.
So soreness is your body not washing out those waste metabolites.
Yeah.
That happens through what we call loose connective tissue, not the dense.
Fascinating. Because, yeah, that's been
where the
such
fascial
a,
literature is fascinating.
yeah, I mean, that's been such a, growing up, it was always, how sore can I get? How much muscle
Right.
fiber can I tear? And
Right.
then you couldn't walk for 3, 4 days. And it was
Right.
like, that was the sign that you had a good workout. And,
Yeah.
you know, what's nice about living in Los Angeles, you're around all these fitness folks. And I've learned over the years that, you know, one of my friends is a great trainer. He started telling me this years ago. He says, you getting yourself that sore is bad for you. You are causing degradation, as you kind of, it's like,
Yeah.
that's a sign that you are not doing the right thing. And that's when I started, like, a light bulb went off for me then. I remember this is years ago, but that I was just a whole paradigm shift in how I viewed working out. So
Yeah.
that's something that is like one of those sort of, what do you call those? Just, like, you know, knowledge or things that we kind of just, it gets passed along that is just incorrect. But, you know, that's what we knew at the time. And as
Right.
you said throughout this whole interview, basically, or this podcast, is that basically things change. What we're learning is changing. We need to constantly be adapting and changing based on what we're learning. Phones don't stay the same. We constantly are evolving in our
Right.
knowledge. So
Yeah. I mean, think about one of the things that happens with soreness, which is, again, an accumulation of fluid. It creates what's called the stretch shielded response, or it alters mechanoreception. And why this is important is because when you ask a panel of experts what they believe is the first thing that sets us up for injury, they believe it's the lack of proprioception. Many experts have said that. And I'm like, that's fascinating, because think about it. What decreases our proprioception? Well, soreness is going to be one factor.
yeah,
Inflammation, a lack of fluid regulation. I mean, all these things. So if I
yeah,
have an athlete or a client who, hey, my calves are really sore, should I play pickleball? The answer is no. No, you need to right now wash that out.
yeah,
You know, it's like thinking that you have the flu and you can go work out and it's going to go away.
yeah.
No, you put more stress into your system.
More stress into the system.
Yeah.
How much do you like these recovery tools like the cold plunge, like the saunas, which are having this huge moment right now? You know, because I get questions about this all the time, and people seem to feel really good. What have you seen in research and are they using this with the professional athletes?
Yeah. I mean, personally, I think probably every tool imaginable, because I'm really interested in it and I like to use things before I advise people. I have access to all these things, but I also at my home have had an infrared sauna with a red light therapy for 10 years. The red light's rather new because they just came out with a newer one that goes in the infrared sauna. I have a cold tub at home, and I have every vibration device. Remember, I've been around for a long time. So I had the very first vibration device. People don't know about this usually. It's called the Terminator. It was built by a chiropractor in San Diego.
Uh
And he took a jigsaw and put a doorstop at the end.
huh.
And you got to wear earphones. It's so loud. I still have it in my garage. It's awesome.
I love it.
It pounds it. It's not for everybody,
Yeah.
but anyway, you know, I've seen the evolution of all these vibrating tools and heat vibration. And because I consult with Hyperice, I know what's in the pipeline right now. There's some very interesting technology coming out. Next year, they're going to have a device where it's going to change ankle sprains.
Nice.
One of the problems with ankle sprains is not the disruption of unity. We already know it's over. Boom, you did it. It's over. The problem is getting the fluid out. Now, it's kind of an interesting thing. Every single human. So again, this is where nature's reality comes into play. Every single human True or false? That has a disruption of immunity, has an inflammatory process. Yeah. So guess what? You're not supposed to stop that.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is to guide it. So even our doctors, our medical doctors, Western medical doctors will tell you the first 3 days you do not take an anti-inflammatory,
Mm-hmm.
because that inflammatory cascade is bringing the essential ingredients to help you heal. So you don't want to stop that. Now, interestingly, if it's really painful, taking a pain medication is different than taking an anti-inflammatory medication. And that could be used to desensitize so that we can get motion.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's no better biopump in the body than your own muscle contraction. And if that muscle contraction is inhibited because of the injury, you don't want that to be inhibited too long. Because if you said it perfectly before, if you don't use it, you lose it. So one of the things that they're developing is a device that really hugs the contour of the foot, because one of the problems with ankle sprains is these fluids get caught in cavities,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really hard to drain. But it's going to be on a timer where you literally can go to bed and this thing pumps all night long.
Mm.
And obviously with a lot of adjustability so that it fits your sensitivity level. But whenever we have a pro athlete whose job solely relies on, getting back to return to play, and you do the rehab the way the average person probably doesn't have access to, it's amazing.
Mm.
The healing response,
Wow.
how much faster it is. Because I've had people in private practice come to me 6 months later and their ankle's still stiff. And I'm like, 6 months,
Yeah.
this stuff should clean up real quick if we can teach people what to do at home. And so companies like Hyperice are doing a fascinating job, with these different tools to help people with their own self-hygiene.
Mm.
Yeah.
Self-hygiene, I love that. That's tissue hygiene was something that you always mentioned, and like
Yeah.
you said, like brushing your teeth, flossing,
Yeah.
which is interesting that we have, the dentist is something that we go to and we just think nothing about. Okay, I'll go twice a year or once a year to the dentist, just like a normalized thing. Whereas sort of this tissue hygiene, and so we go to a physical therapist, in a lot of cases we're treating a symptom that's come up, like, I don't know, my heel started hurting because I've been running. We treat the
Yeah.
symptom, it starts to feel better, we go back to our lives, as opposed to sort of getting into this thing of, well, I should get my tissue worked on sort of on a regular basis,
Yeah.
or before I'm injured, and to have all these sort of good tissue qualities that I want to have, especially as we get into older age. Because a lot of stooping over, I mean, a lot of that's fascial. I mean, the fascia just
Yep.
becomes thick and matted, and it doesn't, just some consistency with treating our tissues the same way we treat our teeth,
Right. And
can go a long
it's
way.
reversible too. That's the
Yeah.
thing. Like, I know you and I have talked about the word fascia, I think, for listeners to understand, because again, there's a lot of people in social media, they're like, oh, you can't stretch fascia. It's an extremely reductionistic way of looking at the human body, right? Fascia can be looked at as a piece of tissue if that's the way you want to look at it. And that's the way surgeons typically, or tradition has typically looked at it. But in today's research, they're talking about the fascial system. It's not a piece of tissue, it's a system that comprises many elements. So anytime I hear an argument on social media about fascia, the first thing I would say in a healthy argument is this: tell me everything you know about loose connective tissue. Because I never see the words loose connective tissue brought up in these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Well, folks, that's what I would study, because it's the loose connective tissue that has high reversibility. It's already been proven through ultrasound. I've seen it in our own ultrasound with our doctors. And I mean, I have video on my computer proving this with hydrodissections, what a hydrodissection does, what manual therapy does to the loose connective tissue, and therefore changes the behavior of the dense connective tissue.
Mm-hmm.
The easiest way to think about this is lasagna. The sheets of pasta are dense connective tissue. You're not changing that with your human hand.
Yeah.
you're changing the stuff in between, which then allows the glidability.
Right.
And that's all been proven. You can see it under ultrasound.
And when you're talking about these layers, the dense connective tissue and the loose, are those both layers of fascia with different concentrations of collagen or whatever? That's.
Yeah. So what it is, it falls under the umbrellas of fascial system. Yeah. You have the dense, and then you have, now the dense can change with what? Load over time. I'm going to need, as in my model, I'm saying, I'm going to need a phase 2 and 3 to change the dense.
Yeah.
Phase 1, I can change. We do it all the time. I mean, how many patients have you had, Joey, where, Joey, my back's stiff. I get up. I don't know what you did, man. You're a magician. That's what you changed, is you changed the loose connective tissue.
Yeah.
Now, in that loose connective tissue, you have sensory elements and you have a lot of these vascular elements. Right. And you're balancing that. You're helping to regulate that.
Yeah.
And listen, a lot of these modalities do that. The flushing, think about what cold does. It collapses everything. Well, what happens homeostatically? It opens it. The benefit is in the exchange. It's not the cold. It's what the cold does to the body. It's kind of like when grandma said, hey, you don't put your jacket on, you're going to catch a cold. Not really. What happens is the cold is a stressor. And if my body's not healthy, that stressor takes me over the edge.
Yeah.
And now my immune system is affected.
Right.
Right. But if you have a healthy body, you can be exposed to various stressors. That's what resiliency means.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things I talk about with cold tubs.
Yeah. So how important is it for a practitioner these days? I mean, everyone should be studying fascia. I mean, it seems like if it's so important to all of these motions, and we did talk about it a little bit in school. We know it's there. Yeah. But I mean, we never went into the details of what we've talked about here, the fluid dynamics.
Yeah. Well, here's what I would say. This is a subject that I've been exposed to for over 20 years, and I've seen the evolution of it. I even see organizations now coming out with books on it. And I like to think of myself as a skeptic with a very open mind, not a closed mind skeptic. But I'm always skeptical of these people because they're regurgitating the work of what I would say the experts. And I was blessed to study the work of, for example, the Stecco family, but then spend a week with them in a laboratory with fresh cadavers, in combination to lectures, in combination to nightly parties where, like you and I, coffee shop talking.
Yeah.
And my point is, and it might
and
sound,
we just say who the Steccos are.
So when I start to look at literature, knowing the history of the Stecco family. So here's how this started. The dad of Antonio Stecco and Carla Stecco started this whole fascial observation. Okay. And obviously had children. So Antonio Stecco and Carla Stecco have really, pushed along the research. But what makes them really fascinating is not only are they medical doctors doing research, and Carla's an anatomist, they're also practicing doctors. So it's very, again, unique to find when you have a researcher, someone in the laboratory, but then they're also practicing with real patients. So, and all you have to do for listeners that are really interested in is Google search, their names. And there's so many papers that they've written on this.
They got amazing books.
And hopefully hire Antonio to come over to the United States in February, because they have a very interesting dynamic ultrasound protocol for thicknesses around the body that first start off as densification, which is again an increase in viscosity that can lead to tendinopathies. So if we can prevent tendinopathies, even in one player, I mean, it's worth our time. Let's put it that way. And so I hope that's you know, in the United States, the direction it's going. But I will sit here today and tell you this. In the United States, we're way behind.
Mm-hmm.
What Brazil is doing, what Germany is doing, and what Italy is doing is way ahead.
Hmm.
And I'm talking about from an evaluation perspective. And then, of course, your evaluation, the more precise that is, the better the treatments are.
Hmm.
And I want to share this with you, Joey, because I talk about our talk, and I have not said this to you one-on-one yet. And correct me if the words come out wrong, but I remember you saying to me, Lenny, I had this patient who I swear was stooped over. We would treat him. He would stand up straight, but it wouldn't last. He went to Florida, got all these injections, and man, I don't know what the hell they did, but he's like walking around. And when you contacted the doc, they wouldn't tell you what they shot in him. And I think I jokingly said it's probably water. Well, I don't know if I got the story exactly right because it was a long time ago, but I have on video, and I'll show it to you sometime. The doctor, Carla Stecco, she told me I could videotape it and share it, of a fascial densification in her anterior tib region. She hydrodissects it, and I have a video of the hydrodissection. And I say, well, what are you injecting in that? You know what she said to me? Good question. We compared all the fancy biologics with pure water. It didn't matter. What mattered was the accuracy of the needle and the fluid pressure. And all I can remember is our talk.
And by the way, I know exactly what you're talking about. And by the way, you would, if you knew how much they were paying for those injections,
oh my God,
you would shit
water.
your pants.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. And I watched him do those injections. He was in our office doing those. And it was great. Under the ultrasound, you could see the fascia, the fascial layers.
Yeah.
But there was this proprietary placental protein blend of something or other. And I was asking questions. And as soon as I started asking questions, he didn't want to talk about it. Because I had seen that before with saline.
Yeah.
And I said, how is this?
Yeah. Yeah.
And sure enough, the patients that had those within a month, they were right back to where they were. But I mean, now they could have kept it. I'm not saying that's a good therapy, but they needed to keep doing those things, which he did encourage, I will say, the movement. You've given them the option of movement. But for the amount that they were paying, it was crazy.
Right. Now, here's what I learned, because this brought up a great conversation, is one, I'm skeptical on what we're injecting because it may not matter. According to Carla, again, she's a researcher, anatomist, and a practicing medical doctor. I was impressed with the accuracy, because the one I have on video was how he had to make an adjustment based on your ultrasound observation and then hand-eye coordination. So that was impressive. The other thing she said, she goes, Lenny, this is where I'm stuck. She goes, I felt great for 3 weeks. We need specific exercises. So again, what did the hydrodissection do? It changed phase 1, but nobody addressed phase 2.
Right.
Nobody addressed phase 2 to 3 and then integrated it back in the pattern. Because if we can then localize a stressor, who knows how long it could last? Because when you look at loose connective tissue in predominantly the major element hyaluronan, it only has a 1/2 to 3 day life. That's why if you work on my back and it feels great, it's not supposed to last. But it can provide us a situation where we decrease sensitivity, increase the glidability of the tissue, so that when we do load, we're more efficient in loading. That's why, back to your original question, what do you think about all these devices? I think they're great if they can complement our work. Just like a toothbrush and floss, great. An electric toothbrush is better than you doing it by hand, because you get more repetition, and doctors really promote that.
Tools.
It doesn't mean you don't go to the hygienist and you don't go to the doctor.
Right.
This has to be a relationship.
Amazing. So what type of things how do you stay up to date with all this stuff? Are you in societies, or are you do you get publications? Where do you suggest people go if they want to learn more about sort of this fascial or any of the things we've talked about today?
Well, I always follow Antonio, Carla, and then also one of their colleagues, Carmelo Piri, Pirri. He was also at this unique seminar class that I went to in the summertime, and he's interesting because he literally has 6 PhDs. I mean, DO, PT, chiropractor. I mean, he's got
Wow.
everything. He's spent his whole life in school, and he has a lot of published research on. And I'll have to show it to you sometime when we get together. But it's kind of fascinating about, like, as we age, for example, it's not the actual fiber that changes; it's actually the mechanoreceptor that
Hmm.
changes. Which
Mm.
then, because of that, we lack the load capacity, and then over time the fiber will change. So it's more of a secondary, tertiary to what they're finding.
Yeah.
So I always follow those people. Dr. Robert Schleip, I love his work. Every year he comes out and does a review of the literature, and he summarizes it, and then he gives you access to the papers. I do that once a year.
Hmm. That's
um,
the Fascia Research Congress or Fascia Research Society, something like that.
No, that's another one to
Okay.
follow. This is just, I go on Instagram and just follow his Instagram
Okay.
page. He'll just do it at his home in Germany. He
Okay.
just did it, in fact. And he did a 1 hour review, and then he does a 1 hour movement with I think it's his wife. She's also a co-author of a couple of his books, and they do like a movement thing for fascia. And then he did a second 1 hour research review. And he's just looking at all the research that's out there
Hmm.
and reviewing it. And on my Instagram, I did a little, I don't know if it was 30 seconds of him talking
Hmm.
about the interstitial stasis. Because as a scientist, and he says it, he starts off with the little tidbit I posted on Instagram. You rarely hear me say all.
Hmm.
Scientists don't like to use the word all, just like they don't like to use the word cure,
Hmm.
right? Because that's like, oh, but he's like, this might be on the right track, right? We
Hmm.
might have just identified things in the body that we never saw before that can really explain the idiopathic pain syndromes that people deal with.
Mm.
So again, I always stay on top of his work. I do in my library have every single fascial book that's ever been printed.
Wow.
Uh, Not that I read them all, but I have them all to actually go through because I like to cross-reference things.
Hmm.
So that's, and I'm still old school. I like to read
Yeah.
books. I like to touch books and write notes in them. So I have all those.
Hmm.
But the way I actually study is using my system.
Hmm.
Like, I want to learn more about the rate of force production. How can I come up with various techniques for the plantar fascia Achilles functional linkage?
Hmm.
So again, like you've seen me post this before, where the plantar fascia and the Achilles tendon is one tissue.
Hmm.
They're not two separate tissues,
Yeah.
just like it's one ocean with 7 names. So how do I load that? And I've always talked about that. Like, people go into dorsiflexion and they quote unquote put length through there. But if you don't put your toes in extension, you're missing 50% of the tensional relationship.
Yeah.
And when you look at sports of all sorts, of all ages, we're using our toes in extension and loading through that linkage. So my point is, like, okay, now that I understand that anatomically, and I can do this through force production, how do I then study ways to do it using the rate of force production? And that's kind of
Hmm.
how I study.
Yeah.
Um, I don't want to just memorize a bunch of things that have no usage. I
Sure.
want to make sure that what I'm studying has direct applicability to what I do for a
You're
living.
implementing it right. Right. You're
Yeah.
testing it.
Yeah. There's the need to know and the nice to know. And I'll be reading papers and I'm like, oh, that's the nice to know.
Hmm.
The need to know, I have to understand at a deeper level.
Yeah.
And then I have to, stay on top of it.
Amazing.
Like Rebecca Pratt, she wrote a paper on hyaluronan. I'll read that like twice a year.
Hmm.
Fascinating, because she put some practical application to it.
Mm.
Um,
Fascinating.
Yeah, this whole paper on interstitial stasis is fascinating to me too, because over time, you start creating your own mental linkages, right? You're like, oh, wow, that relates to DOMs.
Yeah.
Oh, that relates to people getting sore when they work out. And,
Yeah.
what are ways that we can help flush the system?
Yeah.
And also allows you to be critical in your analysis.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the one thing that's evolved is the understanding of the body, how it functions, which means the model has to evolve. We were taught the postural model, even back in the Rolfing days. Now, again, you don't throw those away,
Yeah.
but you're a skeptic and you're like, well, how can we make it more applicable based on the information we know today? Or what is known as the biomechanical model, like looking at the body saying, oh, the right ilium's forward, the left is posterior. So now I'm going to do this technique for that. Well, I would argue that if that person has efficient force production reduction transfer and the rate at which they produce, and we test this stuff on force plates, by the way, it doesn't matter.
I'm
Because
so glad you said that,
it
because
doesn't matter.
so many patients come in and they say,
Yeah.
oh, I've been told that I've got a twisted pelvis.
Yeah.
And I go, that's honestly anatomically mostly normal. So
Yeah.
what?
Doesn't matter.
And people have this in their heads that they've got to fix this pelvic twist.
No.
And I try to talk them to tell them it's just an old way of thinking. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, there's 6 principles that I follow that are principles of nature. They're unarguable, and hey, maybe in 100 years they'll say no. Gravity, we look at gravity different now, but
Yeah.
the point is, it's like I look at these 6 principles all the time, and one of them is humans exhibit a body-wide tensional network.
Mm-hmm.
Even at death, there's tension.
Mm.
A surgeon will tell you that. An anesthesiologist puts you out. Once you cut, you can see that there's always tension in the body. And so if we did have somebody with a twisted pelvis, they came to you and they have right low back discomfort, and you did a palpatory examination and you felt hypertonicity on one side versus the other, then fine.
Yeah.
Use that organization as a way to balance tension. But in the end, you're balancing tension.
Right.
You're not saying that this is going to go here and this is going to go here. We just had someone, they hired a consultant to come in not long ago. He's like, I know why he's got patellofemoral problems. He's got tibial torsion. And it's not a tibial torsion outside of a degree, like
Mm-hmm.
maybe. And you're looking at that. They never tested the force production. They never tested the rate of force production. And then we're looking at, we have one of the fastest, most explosive athletes, Hall of Famer on our team. And, and we have a lot of them where you see these big tibial torsions to the degree you're like, wow, they've had procedures and they're fine.
Yeah.
They're fine. And that goes back to what I said in the very, very beginning.
Yeah.
Is system capacity is different than the local tissue capacity. If the local tissue capacity is there and it maintains, I'm not worried about your position or your posture. That might just be who you are.
I love that example too. You used of like, if you watch LeBron James walk, it's not symmetrical.
He's bow-legged.
Yeah. But he's one of the greatest athletes ever.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, let's say objectively we do a scan and it shows that. You can't change that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how are you going to change the bones?
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is the system that's adapted at this level. And so, again, it's no one's fault. But my analogy is this, man. I'm outside your house every day. I got my journal, staring up the telephone pole, writing notes. And one day you're like, this has been going on for like months. And you go, hey, man, my name's Joey. Just curious, man. What are you doing? And I go, Joey, man, I'm trying to understand the forest. And you're like, hey, man, I want to interrupt your jive here, but suggestion, you might want to go to the forest.
Yeah.
Like, we studied anatomy on dead people. We studied on dead people. And we're trying to understand the living.
Mm.
That's like studying a telephone pole to understand the forest.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a big disconnect there. And I say that to clients all the time, and they look at me like a deer in your headlights, man. They're like, whoa. So when they come in and they're like, it's my hamstrings, man, to be real, I don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it is, but I do know this. Muscle has one behavior. One. Contractile. Now you look up, how many behaviors does connective tissue have? And there's a myriad of behaviors, and many we don't know, because it was the very tissue that we scraped away to understand the muscle. Because yes, muscles contract and they move us. Very, very important. It's a very important organ. Very important. I'm not discounting that, but its one behavior is contractile. What about all the other tissues of the body?
Yeah.
And I use the word connective tissue as people use fascia. Fascia is connective tissue. And technically speaking, all fascia is connective tissue. Not all connective tissue is fascia.
Right.
So I like the word connective tissue because it's named connective, and it allows people to understand that it does connect things. It also disconnects things, right? It creates barriers.
One more thing regarding patient care. What goes through your brain when you get a new patient coming in, and they could be athlete, whoever, and they say, "Hey, nice to meet you. I was working with someone and whatever, and they said that my glutes aren't firing." And like, what goes through your head when you hear that line?
Well, it happens like once a week. I said, if I had a dime for every time, never mind $1, if every time I heard that, I'd be on an island surfing somewhere. Yeah, that's one thing I hopefully encourage young practitioners is really challenge the models out there. Like, where did that come from?
Mm-hmm.
I remember someone posting on this. They show, if you wanted to get down to the nitty gritty, they show overactivation of the glute causes more low back pain than inhibition of the glute.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, how is it measured? What function were you partaking in? Yeah, it's wild.
I still laugh when I think about the time. I don't remember the exact story, but there was someone on the team, is the Clippers, and you said, "Oh, someone said that their glutes weren't firing," and you said, "Man, I could bounce a quarter off his ass." And I still laugh thinking about that because it was so true. I was, so anyhow, that's again, like you said, this is not to say these are things that's natural for these sort of ideas to then perpetuate through a profession, and it's up to us as individuals and as groups to be skeptical and say, okay, what's really happening here? And I think that's the importance of having these type of conversations, and that's my goal, really, is to share and talk about these kind of things so that we can actually be explaining things in a way where we are understanding sort of actually, like I said, what's really happening. And that's just going to push the profession forward. It's going to help patients, and I don't know, that seems like the right thing to do to me.
Yeah. No, it's not like your model, my model's better than the next person's model. It's just trying to say, hey, it's important to have a model that's relative to the person that's in front of you, the team that's in front of you, and know when it doesn't match.
Yeah.
In addition, challenge all models.
Mm-hmm.
Like the most useful model out there will be one that's grounded in nature's principles.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said that I have these 6 that create the foundation, right? And if I said to you, the living body is mainly fluid, who's going to tell me I'm full of shit? Like it is. I mean, I'm just telling you it is. Like I didn't make it up. It's true.
Yeah.
Right. Just like the other one I have is tissues evolve throughout life as a continuous matrix. You talk to any embryologist. That's exactly. So this whole idea of name and blame is a very linear thought process of the reality. Like it's often like, oh, it's the posterior capsule. Is it really? Because it's really a capsule, and the capsule is fascia. Just like when you look at joints are really spaces. It's where 2 bones meet. The architecture gives us that space. what governs a lot of motion with respect to that space is the deep connective tissue called the capsule.
Mm.
But there's really not an anterior and a posterior. It's really a capsule.
Mm.
That doesn't mean you can't do a technique to stress the posterior or
Yeah.
stress the anterior medial lateral, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of getting the terminology down that's relative to the reality.
Yeah.
That's my big thing. Because I think the
Right.
name and blame is kind of the story of the 6 blind men that analyzed an elephant.
Mm.
They all got their parts right, but they didn't realize it was an elephant.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of our big problems. That's
Mm.
where you get all these different biases and a lot of different opinions.
I love that sort of that image. Just as sort of we kind of wrap up here, we just kind of go over that real quick with the elephant and the 6 blind folks, because that's just a great way to illustrate what we're talking about.
It's just a story of 6 blind men, and they show a picture of it. You can look it up on Google, I'm sure. And they're all touching the elephant and they get their parts right, but no one identified it was an elephant.
Mm-hmm. And
so you go to school and you learn everything about the SI joint, you learn everything about the knee, and you forget, well, what is the knee? You just break it down in a very rudimental way. The knee is a joint. A joint's an articulation. What's an articulation? Where bones meet, the femur and the tibia. And I understand the patella, but let's just make it simple. And then the 3rd grader says to you, oh, so the knee is the femur and the tibia. What's the hip? And then the professor says, well, it's the pelvis and the femur. Like, well, wait a minute. You told me the femur was the knee. And so if all you do is specialize in the knee and you forget that there's a foot and a hip, you're in the forest and you forget that it is a forest, right? So the closer you get to the part, which is the 6 blind men, you got to step away. And that's something that if I have to impress upon my children, for example, is it's okay to get into the minutia. It's okay to get into the local, but you always got to pull back out and say to yourself, so what? Give me the global perspective. So having a global view of that person walking into you in our profession, but then appreciating the local reason why they're here and then always pulling it back out, I think is critically important.
Do you teach right now, Lenny? Do you have courses? Are you doing any live teachings?
In the summertime, we like to get out and share. Summertime, because during the season, it's very difficult.
You say we, this is the organization. Is this Gray Institute or?
Yeah, the Gray Institute. We have a couple online courses, the Certified Applied Functional Science program. They call it the CAFS, which is more movement-based. And we've had great success with that because it wasn't like our way, the highway. We taught a process and said, hey, if you understand these fundamentals, you can make up whatever you deem appropriate, kind of like build your own model. And then we have the functional soft tissue transformation, which is more of a hands-on. And I show a plethora of techniques. And it also comes with a very comprehensive PDF. So it shows a lot of resources, where to go for more information, things like that.
That was one of the favorite courses I've ever taken, by the way. Great course.
Thank you. And it's a lot of techniques. And then in the summertime, what I'll do is I'll take the year's worth of learning and then, what I've learned, how I've evolved, and then I'll do a live class and it'll change year to year. And I just present the new information, like what's new, and then how to apply that most importantly.
Amazing. Where can people find you on socials? Do you have Instagram, anything like
just
that?
Just Instagram. And it's all education based. So it's soft_tissue_therapy.
Amazing. Cool.
And then
I'll put a
I'm
link
at
to
the
that.
Meyer Institute of Sport in El Segundo at the Toyota Sports Performance Center.
They have a great setup down there at the Meyer Institute of Sport. Lenny, man, I could keep talking to you for hours, and I'm sure we'll have more conversations, but this has been very, very interesting. So thank you for making the time. Lenny's on the road in San Antonio with the Clippers. You guys are playing tomorrow night, correct?
Yeah.
No game tonight, yeah. So good luck out there, man.
Thank you.
We'll have to do this again, and we could dive into so many more of those topics more in depth. For
sure.
Lenny Parracino, thanks for your time, man, and we will see you soon.
Joey, thank you very much.